Chapter 17. The Saracens. Just as the second day of the great tourney had opened in the valley of the Sepulchre upon the plains below the city of Nimr, a band of swart men in soiled tobs and carrying long matchlocks topped the summit of the pass upon the north side of the valley and looked down upon the city of the Sepulchre and the castle of King Bohun. They had followed upward along what may once have been a trail, but for so long a time had it been unused, or so infrequently had it been used, that it was scarce distinguishable from the surrounding brush. But below them now Edgar saw at a short distance a better marked road, and beyond, what appeared to him a fortress. Beyond that again he glimpsed the battlements of Bohun's castle. What he saw in the foreground was the barbican guarding the approach to the castle and the city, both of which were situated in much the same relative position as were the barbican and castle upon the south side of the valley, where Prince Goberd guarded the city of Nimr and the valley beyond it against the daily expected assault of the Saracens. Seeking cover, Edgar and his Bedouins crept down toward the barbican, where an old knight and a few men-at-arms kept perfunctory ward. Hiding in the mountain brush, the Arabs saw two strangely apparelled blacks hunting just outside the great gateway. They were armed with crossbows and arrows, and their prey was rabbits. For years they had seen no stranger come down this ancient road, and for years they had hunted between the gate and the summit of the mountains, though farther than this they were not permitted to wander. Nor had they any great desire to do so, for though they were descendants of Gallus who lived just beyond this mountain top, they thought that they were Englishmen, and that a horde of Saracens awaited to annihilate them, should they venture too far afield. Today they hunted as they had often hunted when they chanced to be placed in the guard at the outer barbican. They moved silently forward, warily awaiting the break of a rabbit. They did not see the dark-faced men in the brush. Edgar saw that the great gateway was open, and that the gate that closed it raised and lowered vertically. It was raised now. Great was the laxity of the old knight and the men-at-arms, but King Bohun was away and there was none to reprove them. Edgar motioned those nearest him to follow and crept slowly closer to the gateway. What of the old knight and the other watchers? The former was partaking of a late breakfast just within one of the great towers of the barbican, and the latter were taking advantage of the laxity of his discipline to catch a few more winks of sleep as they stretched beneath the shade of some trees within the ballium. Edgar won to within a few yards of the gateway and waited for the others to reach his side. When they were all there he whispered to them, and then trotted on silent sandals toward the gate, his matchlock ready in his hands. Behind him came his fellows. They were all within the ballium before the men-at-arms were aware that there was an enemy this side of Palestine. With crossbow and battle-axe the men-at-arms sprang to defend the gate, their cries of the Saracens. The Saracens brought the old Sir Knight and the hunters running toward the ballium. Below, at the castle of King Bohun, the men at the gates and the other retainers who had been left while Bohun sallied forth to the great tourney heard strange noises from the direction of the outer barbican. The shouts of men floated down to them, and strange, sharp sounds that were like thunder and yet unlike it. Such sounds they had never heard before, nor any of their forebears. They rallied at the outer castle gate, and the knights with them consulted as to what was best to be done. Being brave knights, there seemed but one thing open for them. If those at the far outer barbican had been attacked, they must hasten to their defense. Summoning all but 4 of the knights and men-at-arms at his disposal, the marshal of the castle mounted and rode forth toward the outer gate. Halfway there they were espied by Edgar and his men who, having overcome the poorly armed soldiers at the gate, were advancing down the road toward the castle. At sight of these reinforcements, Edgar hastened to secrete his followers and himself in the bushes that lined the roadway. So it fell that the marshal rode by them and did not see them, and when they had passed, Edgar and his followers came out of the bushes and continued down the winding mountain road toward the castle of King Bohun. The men at the castle gate, now fully upon the alert, stood ready with the portcullis raised as the marshal instructed them, so that in the event that those who had ridden out should be hard pressed upon their return by an enemy at their rear, they could still find sanctuary within the ballium. The plan was, in such event, to lower the portcullis behind the men of the Sepulchre and in the faces of the pursuing Saracens. For that an enemy must be such was a foregone conclusion had not they and their ancestors waited for near 7.5 centuries now for this momentarily expected assault. They wondered if it really had come at last. While they discussed the question, Edgar watched them from a concealing clump of bushes a few yards away. The wily Bedouin knew the purpose of that portcullis, and he was trying to plan best how he might enter the enclosure beyond before it could be dropped before his face. At last he found a plan and smiled. He beckoned 3 men to come close, and into their ears he whispered that which he had in mind. There were 4 men-at-arms ready to drop the portcullis at the psychological moment, and all 4 of them stood in plain sight of Ibn Jad and the 3 that were beside him. Carefully, cautiously, noiselessly, the 4 Arab raised their ancient matchlocks and took careful aim. Now, whispered Ibn Jad, and 4 matchlocks belched forth flame and black powder and slugs of lead. The 4 men-at-arms dropped to the stone flagging, and Ibn Jad and all his followers raced forward and stood within the ballium of the castle of King Bohun. Before them, across the ballium, was another gate and a broad moat, but the drawbridge was lowered, the portcullis raised, and the gateway unguarded. The marshal and his followers had ridden unhindered into the ballium of the outer barbican, and there they had found all its defenders lying in their own blood, even to the little squire of the old knight who should have watched the gate, and did not. One of the men-at-arms still lived, and in his dying breath he gasped the terrible truth. The Saracens had come at last. "Where are they?" demanded the marshal. "Didst thou not see them, sir?" asked the dying man. "They marched down the road toward the castle." "Impossible," cried the marshal. "We didst but ride along that very road and saw no one." "They marched down toward the castle," gasped the man. The marshal knit his brows. "Were there many?" he demanded. "There are few," replied the man-at-arms. "It was but the advance guard of the armies of the Sultan." Just then the volley that laid low the 4 warders at the castle gate crashed upon the ears of the marshal and his men. "Odds blood," he cried. "They must have hid themselves in the bush." As we passed, exclaimed a knight at the marshal's side, "for of a surety they be there and we be here, and there be but one road between." "There be but 4 men at the castle gate," said the marshal, "and I did bid them keep the cullis up till we returned. God pity me, I have given over the sepulchre to the Saracens. Slay me, Sir Morley." "Nay, man, we need every lance and sword and crossbow that we may command. This be no time to think of taking thy life when thou canst give it to our Lord Jesus in defense of his sepulchre against the infidels." "Thou art right, Morley," cried the marshal. "Remain you here, then, with 6 men and hold this gate. I shall return with the others and give battle at the castle." But when the marshal came again to the castle gate, he found the portcullis down and a dark-faced, bearded Saracen glaring at him through the iron bars. The marshal at once ordered the crossbowmen to shoot the fellow down, but as they raised their weapons to their shoulder there was a loud explosion that almost deafened them, and flame leaped from a strange thing that the Saracen held against his shoulder and pointed at them. One of the crossbowmen screamed and lunged forward upon his face, and the others turned and fled. They were brave men in the face of dangers that were natural and to be expected, but in the presence of the supernatural, the weird, the uncanny, they reacted as most men do. And what could have been more weird than death leaping in flame and with a great noise through space to strike their fellow down? But Sir Bulland, the marshal, was a knight of the sepulchre. He might wish to run away fully as much as the simple and lowly men-at-arms, but there was something that held him there that was more potent than fear of death. It is called honor. Sir Bulland could not run away, and so he sat there on his great horse and challenged the Saracens to mortal combat, challenged them to send their doughtiest Sir Knight to meet him, and thus decide who should hold the gate. But the Arab already held it. Furthermore, they did not understand him. In addition to all this, they were without honor, as Sir Bulland knew it, and perhaps as anyone other than a Bedouin knows it, and would but have laughed at his silly suggestion. One thing they did know, 2 things they knew: that he was a Nazarene and that he was unarmed. They did not count his great lance and his sword as weapons, for he could not reach them with either. So one of them took careful aim and shot Sir Bulland through his chainmail where it covered his noble and chivalrous heart. Ibn Jad had the run of the castle of King Bohun, and he was sure that he had discovered the fabled city of Nimr that the Sahar had told him of. He herded together the women and children and the few men that remained and held them under guard. For a while he was minded to slay them, since they were but Nazarene, but he was so pleased at having found and taken the treasure city that he let them live for the time at least. At his command his followers ransacked the castle in search of the treasure, nor were they disappointed, for the riches of Bohun were great. There was gold in the hills of the Valley of the Sepulchre, and there were precious stones to be found there also. For 7.5 centuries the slaves of the Sepulchre and of Nimr had been washing gold from the creek beds and salvaging precious stones from the same source. The real value of such was not to the men of the Sepulchre and Nimr what it would be to men of the outer world. They but esteemed these things as trinkets, yet they liked them and saved them and even bartered for them on occasion, but they did not place them in vaults under lock and key. Why should they in a land where such things were not stolen? Their women and their horses they guarded, but not their gold or their jewels. And so Ebin Jad gathered a great sack full of treasure, enough to satisfy his wildest imaginings of cupidity. He gathered all that he could find in the castle of King Bohun, more than he had hoped to find in this fabled city, and then a strange thing happened. Having more wealth than he possibly could use, he wanted more. No, not so strange after all, for Ebin Jad was human. He spent the night with his followers in the castle of King Bohun, and during the night he planned, for he had seen a wide valley stretching far away to other mountains, and at the base of those mountains he had seen that which appeared to be a city. Perhaps, thought Ibn Jad, it is a richer city than this. I shall start on the morrow to see. Chapter 18. The Black Night. And down the field thundered the two chargers. Silence fell upon the stands. They were almost met when Sir Guy realized that his adversary bore no shield. But what of that? He had been sent into the lists by his own people. The responsibility was theirs, the advantage Sir Guy's. Had they sent him in without a sword, Sir Guy might still have slain him without besmirching his knightly honor, for such were the laws of the great tourney. Yet his discovery had its effect upon the Knight of the Sepulchre, as just for an instant it had distracted his attention from the thought that should have been uppermost in his mind, gaining the primary advantage by the skill of his opening attack. He saw his antagonist's horse swing out just before they met. He stood in his stirrups, as had Sir Malud, to deliver a terrific cut. Then Blake threw his horse straight into the shoulder of Sir Guy's. The latter's sword fell, and with a loud, clanging noise slipped harmlessly from the blade of the Knight of Nimmer. Guy had raised his buckler to protect his own head and neck, and could not see Sir James. Guy's horse stumbled and nearly fell. As it recovered itself, Blake's blade slipped beneath the buckler of the Knight of the Sepulchre, and its point pierced the gorget of his adversary and passed through his throat. With a cry that ended in a blood-choked gurgle, Sir Guy of the Sepulchre toppled backward upon his horse's rump and rolled upon the ground, while the South Stands went mad with joy. The laws of the great tourney account the knight who is unhorsed as slain, so the coup de grace is never given and no knight is killed unnecessarily. The victor rides to the tilt of the vanquished, wheels about and gallops to his own tilt, the full length of the lists, where he waits until a herald of the opposing side fetches the prize to him. And so it was that as Blake swung from his saddle, sword in hand, and approached the fallen Sir Guy, a gasp arose from the South Stands and a roar of angry protest from the North. Marshals and heralds galloped madly from the tilt of the fallen backer, and seeing this, Sir Richard, fearing that Blake would be set upon and slain, led a similar party from his end of the field. Blake approached the fallen knight, who lay upon his back, feebly struggling to arise, and when the spectators looked to see him run Sir Guy through with his sword, they saw him instead toss the weapon to the ground and kneel beside the wounded man. With an arm beneath Sir Guy's shoulders he raised him and held him against his knee while he tore off his helm and gorget, and when the marshals and the heralds and the others drew rein beside him, Blake was trying to staunch the flow of blood. "Quick," he cried to them, a chirurgeon. "His jugular is not touched, but this flow of blood must be stopped." Several of the knights dismounted and gathered about, and among them was Sir Richard. A herald of Sir Guy's faction kneeled and took the youth from Blake's arms. "Come," said Richard, "leave the Sir Knight to his own friends." Blake arose. He saw how peculiar were the expressions upon the faces of the knights about him, but as he drew away, one of them spoke, an older man who was one of Bohun's marshals. "Thou art a generous and chivalrous knight," he said to Blake, "and a courageous one too, who would thus set at naught the laws of the great tourney and the customs of centuries." Blake faced him squarely. "I do not give a damn for your laws or your customs," he said. "Where I come from, a decent man wouldn't let a yellow dog bleed to death without trying to save him, much less a brave and gallant boy like this, and because he fell by my hand, by the customs of my country I should be compelled to aid him." "Yes," explained Sir Richard, as otherwise he would be punished with a raspberry. The winning of the first event of the day was but a forerunner of a series of successes on the part of the Knights of Nimmer until, at the opening of the last event, the score showed 452 points for them against 448 for their opponents. A margin of 4 points, however, was as nothing at this stage of the tourney, as the final event held 100 points which fate might allot almost entirely to one side. This was the most spectacular event of the whole tourney, and one which the spectators always looked forward to with the greatest anticipation. 200 knights were engaged in it, 100 knights of Nimr against 100 knights of the Sepulchre. They formed at opposite ends of the lists, and as the trumpets sounded the signal they charged with lances, and thus they fought until all of one side had been unhorsed or had retired from the field because of wounds. Broken lances could be replaced, as a polo player may ride out and obtain a fresh mallet when he breaks his. Otherwise there were few rules to govern this concluding number of the great tourney, which more nearly approximated a battle scene than any other event of the 3 days of conflict. Blake had won his 15 points for the Knights of Nimr in the opening event of the day, and again with 4 other comrades, pitted against 5 mounted swordsmen from the north, he had helped to add still further points to the growing score of the fronters. He was entered in the last event largely because the marshals appreciated the value of his horsemanship and felt that it would more than compensate for his inexperience with the lance. The 200 mailed knights had paraded for the final event and were forming line at opposite ends of the lists, 100 knights of the Sepulchre at one end and 100 knights of Nimr at the other. Their chargers, especially selected for this encounter, were powerful and fleet, chosen for their courage, as were the youths who bestrode them. The knights, with few exceptions, were youths in their 20s, for to youth went the laurels of this great sport of the Middle Ages, as they still do in the sports of today. Here and there was a man of middle age, a hardened veteran whose heart and hand had withstood the march of years, and whose presence exerted a steadying influence upon the young knights the while it spurred them to their utmost efforts. For these were champions whose deeds were sung by minstrels in the great halls of the castles of Nimr. In proud array, with upright lances and fluttering pennons, the sunlight glinting from burnished mail and bit and boss, and shining brightly upon the gorgeous housings of their mounts, the 200 presented a proud and noble spectacle as they awaited the final summons of the trumpet. Rearing and plunging, eager to be off, many a war horse broke the line as will a thoroughbred at the barrier, while at one side and opposite the center of the lists a herald waited for the moment that both lines should be formed before he gave the signal that would send these iron men hurtling into combat. Blake found himself well toward the center of the line of Nimr's knights, beneath him a great black that fretted to be off, before him the flower of the knighthood of the Sepulchre. In his right hand he grasped a heavy, iron-shod lance, the butt of which rested in a boot at his stirrup, and upon his left arm he bore a great shield, nor had he any wish to discard it in the face of all those sturdy, iron-tipped lances. As he looked down the long length of the lists upon the 100 knights that would presently be racing toward him in solid array, with lance points projecting far ahead of their horses, Blake felt that his shield was entirely inadequate, and he experienced a certain nervousness that reminded him of similar moments of tense waiting for the referee's whistle during his football days, those seemingly long-gone days of another life that he sensed now as a remote and different incarnation. At last came the signal. He saw the herald raise his sword on high. With the 200 he gathered his restive charger and couched his lance. The sword fell. From the 4 corners of the lists trumpets blared, from 200 throats rose the cry de guerre, 400 spurs transmitted the awaited signal from man to horse. The thundering lines bore down the field while a score of heralds raced along the flanks and rear to catch any infraction of the sole regulation that bore upon the final tumultuous collision. Each knight must engage the foe upon his bridle hand, for to couch his lance upon the one to his right was an unknightly act, since thus a single knight might have 2 lances set upon him at once, against which there could be no defense. From above the rim of his shield Blake saw the solid front of lances, iron-shod chargers and great shields almost upon him. The speed, the weight, the momentum seemed irresistible, and metaphorically, with deep respect, Blake took his hat off to the knights of old. Now the 2 lines were about to meet. The spectators sat in spellbound silence. The riders, grim-jawed with tight-set lips, were voiceless now. Blake, his lance across his horse's withers, picked the knight racing toward him upon his left hand. For an instant he caught the other's eyes, and then each crouched behind his shield as the 2 lines came together with a deafening crash. Blake's shield smashed back against his face and body with such terrific force that he was almost carried from his saddle. He felt his own lance strike and splinter, and then, half-stunned, he was through the iron line, his charger frantic and uncontrolled, running wildly toward the tilts of Bohun's knights. With an effort Blake pulled himself together, gathered his reins, and finally managed to get his horse under control. and it was not until he had reined him about that he got his first glimpse of the result of the opening encounter. A half-dozen chargers were scrambling to their feet, and nearly a score more were galloping riderless about the lists. A full 25 knights lay upon the field, and twice that many squires and serving men were running in on foot to succour their masters. Already several of the knights had again set their lances against an enemy, and Blake saw one of the knights of the sepulchre bearing down upon him. But he raised his broken spear shaft above his head to indicate that he was momentarily hors de combat, and galloped swiftly back to his own end of the lists, where Edward was awaiting him with a fresh weapon. "Thou didst nobly well, beloved master," cried Edward. "Did I get my man?" asked Blake. "That thou didst," Sir Edward assured him, beaming with pride and pleasure, "and albeit thou breakest thy lance upon his shield, thou didst e'en so unhorse him." Armed anew, Blake turned back toward the centre of the lists, where many individual encounters were taking place. Already several more knights were down, and the victors looking for new conquests, in which the stands were assisting with hoarse cries and advice, and as Blake rode back into the lists he was espied by many in the north stands occupied by the knights and followers of the sepulchre. "The Black Knight," they cried. "Here, here, Sir Weldred. Here is the Black Knight that overthrew Sir Guy. Have at him, Sir Weldred." Sir Weldred, 100 yards away, couched his lance. "Have at thee, Sir Black Knight," he shouted. "You're on," Blake shouted back, putting spurs to the great black. Sir Weldred was a large man, and he bestrode a raw-boned roan with the speed of a deer and the heart of a lion. The pair would have been a match for the best of Nimr's knighthood. Perhaps it was as well for Blake's peace of mind that Weldred appeared to him like any other knight, and that he did not know that he was the most sung of all the heroes of the sepulchre. As a matter of fact, any knight looked formidable to Blake, who was still at a loss to understand how he had unhorsed his man in the first encounter of this event. The bird must have lost both stirrups, is what he had mentally assured himself when Edward had announced his victory. But he couched his lance like a good Sir Knight and true, and bore down upon the redoubtable Sir Weldred. The Knight of the Sepulchre was charging diagonally across the field from the south stands. Beyond him Blake caught a glimpse of a slim, girlish figure standing in the central lodge. He could not see her eyes, but he knew that they were upon him. "For my princess," he whispered as Sir Weldred loomed large before him. Lance smote on shield as the two knights crashed together with terrific force, and Blake felt himself lifted clear of his saddle and hurled heavily to the ground. He was neither stunned nor badly hurt, and as he sat up a sudden grin wreathed his face, for there, scarce a lance length from him, sat Sir Weldred. But Sir Weldred did not smile. "'Sdeath," he cried. "Thou laughest at me, sirrah." "If I look as funny as you do," Blake assured him, "you've got a laugh coming too." Sir Weldred knit his brows. "Odds blood," he exclaimed. "And thou beest a knight of Nimr, I be a Saracen. Who beest thou? Thy speech savoreth not of the valley." Blake had arisen. "Hurt much?" he asked, stepping forward. "Here, I'll give you a hand up." "Thou art of a certainty a strange Sir Knight," said Weldred. "I recall now that thou didst offer succour to Sir Guy when thou hadst fairly vanquished him." "Well, what's wrong with that?" asked Blake. "I haven't anything against you. We've had a bully good scrap and are out of it. Why should we sit here and make faces at one another?" Sir Weldred shook his head. "Thou art beyond my comprehension," he admitted. By this time their squires and a couple of serving men had arrived, but neither of the fallen knights was so badly injured that he could not walk without assistance. As they started for their respective tilts, Blake turned and smiled at Weldred. "So long, old man," he cried cheerily. "Hope we meet again someday." Still shaking his head, Sir Weldred limped away, followed by the two who had come to assist him. At his tilt, Blake learned that the outcome of the great tourney still hung in the balance, and it was another half-hour before the last of the knights of Nimr went down in defeat, leaving two knights of the Sepulchre victorious upon the field. But this was not enough to overcome the lead of 4 points that the Fronters had held at the opening of the last event, and a moment later the heralds announced that the Knights of Nimr had won the great tourney by the close margin of 2 points. Amidst the shouting of the occupants of the stands at the south, the Knights of Nimr who had taken part in the tourney and had won points for the Fronters formed to ride upon the lists and claim the grand prize. Not all were there, as some had been killed or wounded in encounters that had followed their victories, though the toll on both sides had been much smaller than Blake had imagined that it would be. 5 men were dead and perhaps 22 badly injured to ride, the casualties being about equally divided. As the knights of Nimr rode down the field to claim the 5 maidens from the city of the sepulchre, Bohun gathered all his knights at his side of the lists as though preparing to ride back to his camp. At the same time, a knight of the sepulchre, wearing the leopard skin bassinet of Nimr, entered the stands upon the south side of the field and made his way toward the lodge of Prince Gobred. Bohun watched. The knights of Nimr were at the far end of the field, engrossed in the ritualistic rites that the laws of the great tourney prescribed for the reception of the 5 maidens. Close beside Bohun, 2 young knights sat their chargers, their eyes upon their king, and one of them held the bridle of a riderless horse. Suddenly Bohun raised his hand and spurred across the field, followed by his knights. They moved a little toward the end of the field where the knights of Nimr were congregated, so that the bulk of them were between this end of the field and Gobred's lodge. The young knight, who had sat close beside Bohun, and his companion leading the riderless horse, spurred at a run straight for the stands of Nimr and the lodge of the prince. As they drew in abreast of it, a knight leaped into the lodge from the rear, swept Ginalda into his arms, tossed her quickly to the young knight waiting to receive her, sprang to the edge of the rail, and leaped into the saddle of the spare horse being held in readiness for him. Then they both wheeled and spurred away before the surprised Gobred or those about him could raise a hand to stay them. Behind them swept Bohun and the knights of the sepulchre, out toward the camp among the oaks. Instantly all was pandemonium. A trumpeter in Gobred's lodge sounded the alarm. The prince ran from the stands to the spot where his horse was being held by a groom. The knights of Nimr, ignorant of what had occurred, not knowing where to rally or against whom, milled about the lists for a few moments. Then Gobred came, spurring swiftly before them. "Bohun has stolen the Princess Ginalda," he cried. "Knights of Nimr." But before he could say more or issue orders to his followers, a black knight on a black charger spurred roughly through the ranks of surrounding men and was away after the retreating knights of the sepulchre. Chapter 19. Lord Tarzan. There was a nasty smile upon Tolog's lips as he thought how neatly he had foiled Atija, who would have warned the Nasrani of the plot to slay him, and he thanked Allah that chance had placed him in a position to intercept her before she had been able to ruin them all. Even as Tolog, the brother of the sheik, smiled in his beard, a hand reached out of the darkness behind him and seized him by the throat. Fingers grasped him, and he was dragged away into the bite that had been Zaid's and which had been set up for the Nasrani. Tolog was dragged. He struggled and tried to scream for help, but he was powerless in the grip of steel that held him and choked him. Inside the bait, a voice whispered in his ear. "Cry out, Tolog," it said, "and I shall have to kill you." Then the grasp upon his throat relaxed, but Tolog did not call for help, for he had recognized the voice that spoke, and he knew that it had made no idle threat. He lay still while the bonds were drawn tight about his wrists and ankles and a gag fastened securely in his mouth. He felt the folds of his burnous drawn across his face, and then silence. He heard Stimble creep into the beat, but he thought that it was still he who had bound him. And thus died Tolog, the brother of Ibn Jad, died as he had planned that Tarzan of the apes should die. And, knowing that he would die thus, there was a smile upon the lips of the ape-man as he swung through the forest toward the southeast. Tarzan's quest was not for Bedouins but for Blake. Having assured himself that the white man in the menzil of Ibn Jad was Stimble, and that none knew the whereabouts of the other American, he was hastening back to the locality where Blake's boys had told him their Bwana had disappeared, in the hope of picking up his trail and, if unable to assist him, at least to learn what fate had overtaken him. Tarzan moved swiftly, and his uncanny senses of sight and smell aided him greatly in wresting its secrets from the jungle, yet it was 3 days before he found the spot where Ara the lightning had struck down Blake's gun-bearer. Here he discovered Blake's faint spoor leading toward the north. Tarzan shook his head, for he knew that there was a stretch of uninhabited forest laying between this place and the first Gala villages. Also he knew that if Blake survived hunger and the menace of wild beasts, he might only live to fall victim to a Gala spear. For 2 days Tarzan followed a spoor that no other human eye might have discerned. On the afternoon of the 2nd day he came upon a great stone cross built directly in the center of an ancient trail. Tarzan saw the cross from the concealment of bushes, for he moved as beasts of prey moved, taking advantage of every cover, suspicious of every strange object, always ready for flight or battle as occasion might demand. So it was that he did not walk blindly into the clutches of the 2 men-at-arms that guarded the outer way to the city of Nimr. To his keen ears was borne the sound of their voices long before he saw them. Even as Sheeta or Numa approached their prey, so Tarzan of the Apes crept through the brush until he lay within a few yards of the men-at-arms. To his vast astonishment he heard them conversing in a quaint form of English that, while understandable to him, seemed yet a foreign tongue. He marveled at their antiquated costumes and obsolete weapons, and in them he saw an explanation of Blake's disappearance and a suggestion of his fate. For a time Tarzan lay watching the two with steady, unblinking eyes. It might have been Numa himself, weighing the chances of a sudden charge. He saw that each was armed with a sturdy pike and a sword. They could speak English after a fashion, therefore he argued they might be able to give him word of Blake, but would they receive him in a friendly spirit, or would they attempt to set upon and slay him? He determined that he could never ascertain what their attitude would be by lying hidden among the brush, and so he gathered himself as Numa does when he is about to spring. The 2 blacks were idly gossiping, their minds as far from thoughts of danger as it were possible they could be, when suddenly without warning Tarzan launched himself full upon the back of the Nira, hurling him to the ground. Before the other could gather his wits, the ape-man had dragged his victim into the concealment of the bush from which he had sprung, while the fellow's companion turned and fled in the direction of the tunnel. The man in Tarzan's grasp fought and struggled to be free, but the ape-man held him as easily as he might have held a child. "Lie still," he advised, "I shall not harm you." "Odds blood," cried the black. "What manner of creature be thou?" "One who will not harm you if you will tell him the truth," replied Tarzan. "What wouldst thou know?" demanded the black. "A white man came this way many weeks ago. Where is he?" "Thou speakest of Sir James?" asked the soldier. Sir James, mused Tarzan, and then he recollected that Blake's first name was James. "His name was James," he replied, "James Blake." "Verily, 'tis the same," said the soldier. "You have seen him? Where is he now?" "He be defending the honor of our Lord Jesus and the knights of Nimr in the great tourney in the lists upon the plain below the city. And have ye come to wreak despite upon our good Sir James? Thou wilt find many doughty knights and men-at-arms who wilt take up the gage in his behalf." "I am his friend," said Tarzan. "Then why didst thou leap upon me thus, if thou beest a friend to Sir James?" demanded the man. "I did not know how you had received him or how you would receive me." "A friend of Sir James will be received well in Nimr," said the man. Tarzan took the man's sword from him and permitted him to rise his pike he had dropped before being dragged among the bushes. "Go before me and lead me to your master," commanded the ape-man, "and remember that your life will be the forfeit that you must pay for treachery." "Do not make me leave the road unguarded against the Saracens," begged the man. "Soon my companion will return with others, and then I shall beg them to take thee where thou wilt." "Very well," agreed the ape-man. They had not waited long before he heard the sound of hastening footsteps and a strange jingling and clanking that might have been caused by the shaking of many chains and the striking against them of objects of metal. Shortly afterward he was surprised to see a white man clothed in chainmail and carrying a sword and buckler descending the trail at a trot, 12 pikemen at his back. "Tell them to halt," commanded Tarzan, placing the point of the man's sword in the small of his back. "Tell them I would talk with them before they approached too closely." "Stop, I pray thee," cried the fellow. "This be a friend of Sir James, but he wilt run me through with my own sword an ye press him too close. Parley with him, most noble Sir Knight, for I wouldst live at least to know the result of the great tourney." The knight halted a few paces from Tarzan and looked him up and down from feet to head. "Thou art truly a friend to Sir James?" he demanded. Tarzan nodded. "I have been seeking him for days." "And some mishap befell thee, and thou lost thy apparel?" The ape-man smiled. "I go thus in the jungle," he said. "Art thou a Sir Knight, and from the same country as Sir James?" "I am an Englishman," replied Tarzan of the Apes. "An Englishman. Thrice welcome then to Nimr. I be Sir Bertram, and a good friend to Sir James." "And I am called Tarzan," said the ape-man. "And thy rank?" inquired Sir Bertram. Tarzan was mystified by the strange manners and garb of his seemingly friendly inquisitor, but he sensed that whatever the man might be, he took himself quite seriously and would be more impressed if he knew that Tarzan was a man of position, and so he answered him truthfully, in his quiet way. "Ea, Viscount," he said. "A peer of the realm," exclaimed Sir Bertram. "Prince Gobred wilt be oea pleased to greet thee, Lord Tarzan. Come thou with me, and I wilt furnish thee with apparel that befits thee." At the outer barbican, Bertram took Tarzan into the quarters reserved for the knight commanding the warders, and kept him there while he sent his squire to the castle to fetch raiment and a horse. And while they waited, Bertram told Tarzan all that had befallen Blake since his arrival in Nimmer, and, too, much of the strange history of this unknown British colony. When the squire returned with the clothing, it was found that it fitted the ape-man well, for Bertram was a large man, and presently Tarzan of the Apes was garbed as a knight of Nimmer, and was riding down toward the castle with Sir Bertram. Here the knight announced him at the gate as the Lord Viscount Tarzan. Once within, he introduced him to another knight whom he persuaded to relieve him at the gate, while he conducted Tarzan to the lists that he might be presented to Gobred and witness the final scenes of the tourney, were it not concluded before they arrived. And so it was that Tarzan of the Apes, clad in chainmail and armed with lance and sword, rode down into the Valley of the Sepulchre just as Bohun put his foul scheme into execution and carried off the Princess Ginolda. Long before they reached the lists, Bertram was aware that something was amiss, for they could see the dust clouds racing rapidly north away from the lists, as though one body of knights pursued another. He put spur to his mount, and Tarzan followed suit, and so they came at a stiff run to the lists, and there they found all pandemonium. The women were mounting preparatory to riding back to Nimmer under escort of a few knights that Gobred had sent back to guard them. The men-at-arms were forming themselves into companies, but all was being done in a confused manner, since every now and then a great part of the company would rush to the highest part of the stands and peer off toward the north after the clouds of dust that revealed nothing to them. Sir Bertram accosted one of his fellows. "What hath befallen?" he demanded. "Bohun hath seized the Princess Ginolda and carried her away," came the astounding reply. "Zounds," cried Bertram, reining about. "Wilt ride with me in the service of our princess, Lord Tarzan?" For answer, Tarzan spurred his horse alongside of Bertram's, and stirrup to stirrup the two set out across the plain, while far ahead of them Blake drew gradually closer and closer to the fleeing knights of the Sepulchre. So thick the cloud of dust they threw up that they were hid from their pursuer even as he was hid from them, and so were unaware that Blake was near them. The American carried no lance nor shield, but his sword clattered and clashed at his side, and at his right hip swung his 45. Whenever he had been armed, since he entered Nimmer, he had carried this weapon of another world and another age. To their queries he had answered that it was but a lucky talisman that he carried, but in his heart was the thought that some day it might stand him in better stead than these simple knights and ladies could dream. He knew that he would never use it except in battle, or as a last resort against overwhelming odds or unfair tactics, but he was glad that he carried it today, as it might mean the difference between liberty and captivity for the woman he loved. Slowly he drew closer to the rearmost knights of the Sepulchre, their mounts bred and trained to the utmost endurance, and to carry the great weight of man and mail kept to a brisk canter even after the first long spurt of speed that had carried them away from the lists of Nimmer. The dust rolled up in clouds from iron-shod feet. Through it Blake groped, catching vague glimpses of mounted men just ahead. The black, powerful fleet, courageous, showed no sign of fatigue. The rider carried his sword in his hand ready. He was no longer a black knight, but a grey. Bassinet, hauberk, all the rich caparisons of his horse, the horse itself, were grey with dust. Blake glimpsed a knight toward whom he was slowly drawing closer. This knight was grey. Like a flash, Blake realized the value of the camouflage that chance had laid upon him. He might ride among them and they would not suspect that he was not of them. Instantly he sheathed his sword and pressed forward, but he edged off a little from the knight before he passed him. Urging the black ever a little faster, Blake crept up through the ranks of Bohun's knights. Somewhere a knight was carrying double, and this knight he sought. The nearer the head of the column he forged, the greater became the danger of discovery, for now the dust was less thick and men could see farther, but yet his own armor, his face, the leopard skin of his bassinet were coated thick with grey, and though knights peered intently at him as he passed, none recognized him. Once one hailed him. "Isn't thou Percival?" he demanded. "Nay," replied Blake, and spurred on a trifle faster. Now, dimly just ahead, he saw several knights bunched close, and once he thought he glimpsed the fluttering garments of a woman in their midst. Pressing on, he drew close behind these, and there, Surrounded by knights, he saw a woman held before one of the riders. Drawing his sword, he spurred straight between two knights who rode close behind he who carried Guinalda, and as Blake passed he cut to the right and left, and the two knights rolled from their saddles. At a touch of the spurs, the black leaped abreast the young knight that was bearing off the princess. So quickly was the thing accomplished that the knights who rode scarce an arm's length from him had not the time to realize what was occurring and prevent it. Blake slipped his left arm about the girl and at the same time thrust to the left above his left forearm, driving his blade far into the body of the youthful knight. Then he spurred forward, carrying Guinalda from the dead arms as the knight pitched headlong from his saddle. Blake's sword was wrenched from his grasp, so far had he driven it into the body of the man who dared commit this wrong against the woman Blake loved. Cries of rage arose about him as knights spurred in pursuit, and the black ran free with no guiding hand upon the reins. A huge fellow loomed just at Blake's rear, and another was closing in from the other side. The first man swung his sword as he stood in his stirrups, and the second was already reaching for Blake with his point. Strange oaths were on their lips, and their countenances were contorted by rage as they strove to have the life of the rash man who had almost thwarted them in their design, but that he could succeed they had not the remotest belief, for he was 1 against 1,000. Then something happened the like of which had never been known to them or their progenitors. A blue-barreled .45 flashed from the holster at Blake's hip. There was a loud report, and the knight upon Blake's right rear lunged head foremost to the ground. Blake turned in his saddle and shot the knight upon his other side between the eyes. Terrified, the horses of other knights close by who might have menaced him bolted, as did the great black that Blake bestrode. But while the American was trying to replace his weapon in its holster and gather the reins in his right hand, he leaned to the left, and thus forced the horse slowly around toward the direction he wished him to go. Blake's plan being to cut across the front of the Knights of the Sepulchre and then turn southward toward Nimmer. He was sure that Gobred and his followers must be close in pursuit, and that it would be but a matter of minutes before he would have Guinalda safe behind 1,000 or more knights, any one of whom would lay down his life for her. But the Knights of the Sepulchre had spread out over a greater front than Blake had anticipated, and now he saw them coming rapidly upon his left and was forced to swerve in a more northerly direction. Closer and closer they came, and once more the American found it necessary to drop his reins and draw his .45. One shot sent the horses of the menacing knights rearing and plunging away from the terrifying sound, and it sent the black into a new paroxysm of terror that almost resulted in Blake and the girl being unhorsed. When the man finally brought the animal again under control, the dust cloud that marked the position of the Knights of the Sepulchre was far behind, and close upon Blake's left was a great forest, whose dark depths offered concealment for the moment at least. Reining quickly within, Sir James drew up and gently lowered Guinalda to the ground. Then he dismounted and tied the black to a tree, for Blake was spent after what he had been through this day since his first entry upon the lists, and the black was spent as well. He slipped the housing and the heavy saddle from the horse's back, and took the great bit from his mouth, replacing a portion of the housing to serve as a cooler until the horse should be less heated, nor once did he glance at the princess until he had finished caring for his horse. Then he turned and faced her. She was standing leaning against a tree, looking at him. "Thou art a brave, Sir Knight," she said softly, and then added arrogantly, "but still a boor." Blake smiled wanly. He was very tired and had no wish to argue. "I'm sorry to ask you to do it," he said, ignoring what she had said to him, "but Sir Galahad here will have to be kept moving about a bit until he cools off, and I'm too fagged to do it." The Princess Guinalda looked at him in wide-eyed amazement. Yea, she stammered, "Ye mean that I should lead the beast? I, a princess?" "I can't do it," Guinalda replied. "Blake, I tell you I'm just about all in, lugging all these skid chains about since sunrise. I guess you'll have to do it." "I have to." "Durst thou command, knave?" "Snap out of it, girl," advised Blake curtly. "I'm responsible for your safety, and it may all depend on this horse. Get busy, and do as I tell you. Lead him back and forth slowly." There were tears of rage in the eyes of the Princess Guinalda as she prepared to make an angry retort, but there was something in Blake's eyes that silenced her. She looked at him for a long moment, and then turned and walked to Black. Untying the rope that tethered him to the tree, she led him slowly to and fro, while Blake sat with his back against a great tree and watched out across the plain for the first sign of pursuit. But there was no pursuit, for the Knights of Nimr had overtaken the Knights of the Sepulchre, and the two forces were engaging in a running fight that was leading them farther and farther and farther away toward the city of the Sepulchre upon the north side of the valley. Gunalda led the black for half an hour. She led him in silence, and in silence Blake sat gazing out across the valley. Presently he turned toward the girl and rose to his feet. "That'll be good," he said, approaching her. "Thank you. I'll rub him a bit now. I was too exhausted to do it before." Without a word she turned the black over to him, and with dry leaves he rubbed the animal from muzzle to dock. When he had finished he threw the housing over him again, and came and sat down beside the girl. He let his eyes wander to her profile, to her straight nose, her short upper lip, her haughty chin. She is beautiful, thought Blake, but selfish, arrogant, and cruel. But when she turned her eyes toward him, even though they passed over him as though he had not been there, they seemed to belie all the other evidence against her. He noticed that her eyes were never quiet. Her glances roved from place to place, but most often into the depths of the wood and upward among the branches of the trees. Once she started and turned suddenly to gaze intently into the forest. "What is it?" asked Blake. "Methought something moved within the wood," she said. "Let us be gone." "It is almost dusk," he replied. "When it is dark we can ride to Nimr in safety. Some of Bohun's knights may still be searching for you." "What?" she exclaimed. "Remain here until dark. Knowest thou not where we be?" "Why, what's wrong with this place?" demanded the man. She leaned toward him, her eyes wide with terror. "It be the wood of the leopards," she whispered. "Yes," he queried casually. "Here lair the great leopards of Nimr," she continued, "and after nightfalls only a camp with many guards and beast fires be safe from them. And even so, not always then, for they have been known to leap upon a warder and, dragging him into the wood, devour him within hearing of the camp." But suddenly her eyes responded to a new thought. "I hadst forgot the strange, roaring weapon with which thou slew the knights of Bohun. Of a surety with that thou couldst slay all the leopards of the wood." Blake hesitated to undeceive her and add to her alarm. "Perhaps," he said, "it will be as well to start now, for we have a long ride and it will soon be dark." As he spoke he started towards Sir Galahad. He had almost reached the horse when the animal suddenly raised its head, and with up-pricked ears and dilated nostrils looked into the gathering shadows of the wood. For an instant Sir Galahad trembled like a leaf, and then, with a wild snort, he lay back with all his weight upon the tether, and as it parted with a snap he wheeled and raced out upon the plain. Blake drew his gun and peered into the wood, but he saw nothing, nor could his atrophied sense of smell catch the scent that had come so clearly to the nostrils of Sir Galahad. Eyes that he could not see were watching him, but they were not the eyes of Sheeta the leopard. Chapter 20. I Love You. Lord Tarzan rode with Sir Bertram in the wake of the Knights of Nimr, nor did they overtake them until after Blake had borne Gunalda out of the battle which had followed immediately the hosts of Gobred had overhauled the Knights of the Sepulchre. As the two approached, Tarzan saw opposing knights paired off in mortal combat. He saw a knight of Nimr go down before an adversary's lance, and then the victor espied Tarzan. "Have at you, Sir Knight," cried he of the Sepulchre, and couched his lance and put spurs to his charger. This was a new experience for the ape-man, a new adventure, a new thrill. He knew as much about jousting as he did about ping-pong, but from childhood he had wielded a spear, and so he smiled as the knight charged upon him. Lord Tarzan waited, and the Knight of the Sepulchre was disconcerted to see his adversary awaiting him, motionless, his spear not even couched to receive him. Lord Bertram had reined in his horse to watch the combat and observe how this English peer accounted for himself in battle, and he too was perplexed. Was the man mad, or was he fearful of the issue? As his antagonist approached him, Tarzan rose in his stirrups and carried his lance hand above and behind his head. And when the tip of the other's lance was yet 5 paces from him, the ape-man launched the heavy weapon, as he had so often launched his hunting spear and his war spear and his war spear in the chase and in battle. It was not Viscount Greystoke who faced the Knight of the Sepulchre, it was not the King of the Great Apes, it was the chief of the Waziri, and no other arm in the world could cast a war spear as could his. Forward his spear hand shot, straight as an arrow sped the great lance. It struck the shield of the Knight of the Sepulchre just above the boss, and splitting the heavy wood, drove into the heart of Tarzan's foe, and at the same instant the ape-man reined his horse aside as that of his fallen antagonist thundered past. Sir Bertram shook his head and spurred to meet an antagonist that had just challenged him. He was not sure that the act of Lord Tarzan had been entirely ethical, but he had to admit that it had been magnificent. The fortunes of the battle carried Tarzan toward the west. His lance gone, he fought with his sword. Luck and his great strength and wondrous agility carried him through 2 encounters. By this time the battle had drawn off toward the northeast. Tarzan had accounted for his second man since he had lost his lance, and a knight of the sepulchre had slain a knight of Nimr. Now these 2 remained alone upon the field, nor did the other lose a moment in shouting his challenge to the ape-man. Never in his life had Tarzan seen such fierce, bold men, such gluttons for battle, that they glorified in conflict and in death with a fierce lust that surpassed the maddest fanaticism he had ever witnessed filled Tarzan's breast with admiration. What men! What warriors! Now the last night was upon him. Their swords clashed on ready buckler, they wheeled and turned and struck again. They passed and spurred once more to close quarters. Each rose in his stirrups to deliver a terrifying cut, each sought to cleave the other's skull. The blade of the knight of the sepulchre glanced from Tarzan's buckler and bit into the skull of the ape-man's charger, but Tarzan's edge smote true. As his horse went down, Tarzan leaped free, his antagonist falling dead at his feet, while the riderless horse of the slain knight galloped swiftly off in the direction in which lay the city of the sepulchre. Tarzan looked about him. He was alone upon the field. Far to the north and east he saw the dust of battle. The city of Nimr lay across the plain toward the south. When the battle was over, it was there that Blake would ride, and it was Blake whom Tarzan wanted to find. The sun was sinking behind the western hills as Tarzan turned toward Nimr. The chainmail that he wore was heavy, hot, and uncomfortable, and Tarzan had not gone far before he discarded it. He had his knife and his rope. These he always kept with him, but he left the sword with the armor, and with a sigh of relief continued on his way. Ibn Jad, as he had come across the valley from the city of the sepulchre toward the city that he had seen upon the opposite side, had been perturbed by the great clouds of dust that had been raised by the knights of the sepulchre and the pursuing Nimrians. Seeing a forest close upon his right hand, he had thought it wiser to seek its concealing shadows until he could learn more concerning that which caused so great a dust cloud, which he saw was rapidly approaching. Within the forest it was cool, and here Ibn Jad and his followers rested. "Let us remain here," suggested Abd el-Aziz, "until evening, when we may approach the city under cover of darkness." Ibn Jad approved the plan, and so they camped just within the forest and waited. They watched the dust cloud pass and continue on toward the city of the sepulchre. "Billah, it is well we did escape that village before yon host returned," said Ibn Jad. They saw a horseman enter the forest, or pass to the south of it, they could not know which, but they were not interested in single horsemen, or in any horseman, so they did not investigate. He seemed to be either carrying another person upon his horse with him, or some great bundle. At a distance they could not see which. "Perhaps," said Abd el-Aziz, "we shall find greater treasure in the city to the south." "And perhaps the beautiful woman of whom the Sahar spoke," added Ibn Jad, "for she was not within the city we left this morning." "There were some there that were beautiful," said Fa'adi. "The one I seek is more beautiful than an houri," said Ibn Jad. When they took up their march again, just before dark, they moved cautiously just within the edge of the forest. They had covered a mile, perhaps, when those in the lead heard voices ahead. Ibn Jad sent one to investigate. The man was soon back. His eyes were bright with excitement. "Ibn Jad," he whispered, "thou needst seek no farther, the houri is just ahead." Following the suggestion of the scout, Ibn Jad, followed by his companions, went deeper into the woods and approached Blake and Ginalda from the west. When Sir Galahad broke loose and Blake drew his 45, Ibn Jad knew that they could remain in concealment no longer. He called Fa'd to him. "Many of the Nasranis speak the language thou didst learn among the soldiers of the north," he said. "Speak thou therefore to this one in the same tongue, telling him we are friends and that we are lost." When Fa'd saw the Princess Guinalda, his eyes narrowed and he trembled almost as might a man with ague. Never in his life had Fa'd seen so beautiful a woman. Never had he dreamed that an houri might be so lovely. "Do not fire upon us," he called to Blake from the concealment of some bushes. "We are friends, we are lost." "Who are you?" demanded Blake, surprised to hear French spoken in the valley of the sepulchre. "We be poor men from the desert country," replied Fa'd. "We are lost. Help us to find our way, and the blessings of Allah shall be upon thee." "Come out and let me see you," said Blake. If you are friendly, you need not fear me. I've had all the trouble I'm looking for. Fa Dandy bin Jad stepped out into view, and at sight of them Ginalda voiced a little scream and seized Blake's arm. The Saracens, she gasped. I guess they're Saracens all right, said Blake, but you needn't worry, they won't hurt you. Not harm a crusader, she demanded incredulously. These fellows never heard of a crusader. Me likes not the way they look at me, whispered Ginalda. Well, neither do I, but perhaps they mean no harm. With many smiles the Arabs gathered around the two, and through Fa Bin Jad repeated his protestations of friendship and his delight at meeting one who could direct him from the valley. He asked many questions about the city of Nimr, and all the while his followers pressed closer to Blake. Of a sudden the smiles vanished from their faces as, at a signal from their sheikh, 4 stalwart Bedouins leapt upon the American and bore him to the ground, snatching his gun from him, while simultaneously 2 others seized the Princess Ginalda. In a moment Blake was securely bound, and the Arab were debating what disposition to make of him. Several wanted to slit his throat, but Ibn Jad counseled against it, since they were in a valley filled with the man's friends, and should the fortunes of war decide to throw some of the Bedouins into the hands of the enemy, such would fare better if they spared this one's life. Blake threatened, promised, begged that they give Ginalda her liberty, but Fahd only laughed at him and spit upon him. For a time it seemed almost certain that they were going to kill Blake, as one of the Bedouins stood over him with a keen kusa in his hand, awaiting the word from Ibn Jad. It was then that Ginalda tore free from those who held her and threw herself upon Blake to shield his body from the blade with her own. Thou shalt not slay him, she cried. Take my life and thou must have Christian blood, but spare him. They cannot understand you, Ginalda, said Blake. Perhaps they will not kill me, but that does not matter. You must escape them. Oh, they must not kill thee, they shall not. Canst ever forgive me the cruel words I spoke? I did not mean them. My pride was hurt that thou shouldst say of me what Malud told me thou didst say, and so I spoke to hurt thee, and not from my heart. Canst forgive me? Forgive you. God love you, I could forgive you murder. But what did Malud tell you I had said? Oh, mind not now. I care not what thou said. I tell thee I forgive it. Say to me again thy words that thou didst speak when I pinned my favor upon thy hauberk, and I can forgive thee anything. What did Malud say? Insisted Blake. That thou hadst bragged that thou wouldst win me and then cast my love aside, she whispered. In the cur, you must know that he lied, Ginalda. Say what I have asked, and I shall know he lied, she insisted. I love you. I love you, Ginalda, cried Blake. The Arabs laid heavy hands upon the girl and dragged her to her feet. Ibn Jad and the others still argued about the disposition to be made of Blake. By Allah, exclaimed the sheikh, at last we shall leave the Nasrani where he lies, and if he die none can say that the Bijou did slay him. Abd el-Aziz, he continued, let thou take men and continue across the valley to that other city. Come, I shall accompany you away, and we will talk out of hearing of this Nasrani who perchance understandeth more of our tongue than he would have us guess. As they moved away toward the south, Ginalda tried to free herself again from the grasp of her captors, but they dragged her with them. Until the last Blake saw her struggling and saw her dear face turned toward him, and as they passed out of sight among the trees she called back through the falling night 3 words that meant more to him than all the languages of all the world combined: I love you. At a distance from Blake the Arab halted. I leave thee here, Abd el-Aziz, said Ibn Jad. Go thou and see if the city appears to be a rich place, and if it be too strongly guarded make no attempt to loot it, but return to the menzil that will be just beyond the northern summit where it now is, or if we move it, we shall make our trail plain that you may follow us. I shall hasten from the valley with this rich treasure that we now have, not the least of which is the woman, Billah. In the north she will fetch the ransom of a dozen sheikh. Go, Abd el-Aziz, and may Allah be with thee. Ibn Jad turned directly north. His belief that the great body of horsemen he had glimpsed amid the distant dust were returning to the city he had sacked argued against his attempting to leave the valley by the same route that he had entered it. And so he had determined to attempt to scale the steep mountains at a point west of the city of the sepulchre, avoiding the castle and its defenders entirely. Blake heard the retreating footsteps of the Bedouins die away in the distance. He struggled with his bonds, but the camel leather held securely. Then he lay quiet. How silent, how lonely the great, black wood, the wood of the leopards. Blake listened. Momentarily he expected to hear the fall of padded feet, the sound of a great, furred body approaching through the underbrush. The slow minutes dragged. An hour had passed. The moon rose, a great, swollen, red moon that floated silently up from behind distant mountains. This moon was looking down upon Guinalda as it was on him. He whispered a message to it, a message to it, a message for his princess. It was the first time that Blake ever had been in love, and he almost forgot his bonds and the leopards in recalling those 3 words that Guinalda had called back at the instant of their separation. What was that? Blake strained his eyes into the darkness of the shadowy wood. Something was moving. Yes, it was the sound of stealthy, padded feet, the scraping of a furred body against leaves and twigs. The leopard of the wood was coming. Hark! There must be another in a nearby tree, for he was sure that he could see a shadowy form almost above him. The moonlight, shining from the low moon near the eastern horizon, crept beneath the trees and lighted the ground upon which Blake lay, and beyond him for a dozen yards and more. Presently into this moonlit space stepped a great leopard. Blake saw the blazing eyes, felt them burning into him like fire. He could not tear his own from the great snarling figure, where they were held in awful fascination. The carnivore crouched and crept closer. Inch by inch it crept upon him as though with the studied cruelty of premeditated torture. He saw the sinuous tail lashing from side to side. He saw the great fangs bared. He saw the beast flatten against the ground, its muscles tensed. It was about to spring. Helpless, horrified, Blake could not take his eyes from the hideous, snarling face. He saw it leap suddenly with the lightness and agility of a house cat, and at the same instant he saw something flash through the air. The leopard stopped in mid-leap and was jerked backward, and then Blake's astonished eyes saw it being hauled upward into a tree that overhung the spot. He saw the shadowy form that he had seen before, but now he saw that it was a man, and that he was hauling the leopard upward by a rope that had been cast about its neck at the instant that it had risen to leap upon him. Screaming, pawing with raking talons, Sheeta the leopard was dragged upward. A mighty hand reached out and grasped the great cat by the scruff of the neck, and another hand drove a knife blade into the savage heart. When Sheeta ceased to struggle and hung quiet, the hand released its grasp and the dead body of the carnivore thudded to the ground beside Blake. Then the godlike figure of an almost naked white man dropped lightly to the leafy mold. Blake voiced an exclamation of surprised delight. "Tarzan of the apes," he cried. Blake demanded the ape man, "And then at last, and I didn't find you much too soon either." "I'll tell the world you didn't," exclaimed Blake. Tarzan cut the bonds that held the American. "You've been looking for me?" asked Blake. "Ever since I learned that you had become separated from your safari." "By George, that was white of you. Who left you trussed up here?" "A bunch of Arabs." Something like a growl escaped the lips of the ape man. "That villainous old Ibn Jad here?" he demanded incredulously. "They took a girl who was with me," said Blake. "I do not need to ask you to help me rescue her, I know." "Which way did they go?" asked Tarzan. There Blake pointed toward the south. "When?" "About an hour ago." "You'd better shed that armor," advised Tarzan. "It makes walking a punishment. I just tried it." With the ape man's help, Blake got out of his coat of mail, and then the two set out upon the plain trail of the Arabs. At the point where Ibn Jad had turned back toward the north, they were at a loss to know which of the two spoors to follow, for here the footprints of Guinalda, that the ape man had been able to pick up from time to time since they left the spot where the girl had been seized, disappeared entirely. They wondered what had become of them. They could not know that here, when she found that Ibn Jad was going to turn back with her away from Nimr, she had refused to walk farther. It had been all right as long as they were approaching Nimr, but she refused absolutely to be a party to her own abduction when it led away from home. What breeze there was blowing from the east, nullifying the value of Tarzan's sense of smell, so that even the great ape man could not know in what direction or with which party Guinalda had been carried off. "The most reasonable assumption," said Tarzan, "is that your princess is with the party that has gone north. For I know that Ibn Jad's menzil must lay in that direction. He did not enter the valley from the south. That I know because I just came in that way myself, and Sir Bertram assured me that there are only two entrances, the one through which I came and a pass above the city of the sepulchre." Ibn Jad would want to get the girl out of the valley and into his camp as soon as possible, whether he is going to hold her for ransom or take her north to sell her. The party that went south toward Nimr may have been sent to treat with her people for a ransom, but the chances are that she is not with that party. However, it is at best but a matter of conjecture. We must ascertain definitely, and I suggest that you follow the northern spoor, which is, I am certain, the one that will lead to the girl, while I overtake the party to the south. I can travel faster than you, and if I am right and the girl is with the northern party, I'll turn back and overtake you without much loss of time. If you catch up with the other band and find the girl is not with them, you can turn back and join me. But if she is with them, you'd better not risk trying to recover her until you have help, for you are unarmed and those Bedouins would think no more of cutting your throat than they would of drinking a cup of coffee. Now, goodbye and good luck, and Tarzan of the Apes was off at a trot upon the trail of the party that had gone in the direction of Nimr, while Blake turned northward to face a dismal journey through the black depths of the Wood of the Leopards.